Thank you very much, David, for that introduction. And yes, I've never been to a climate change conference with poetry, I have to say. So at least we achieved this. You started out with, is it half full or half empty? And to some extent, even this picture, should the cheers and the applauses of Paris lead us to focus on the hope, if you want, of the green coming out? Or should we still focus on the dry land, on the negative effects of climate change? Let me take you through my presentation that will not give you a detailed nor comprehensive account of Paris. It's way too complicated to do in only 20 minutes. But at least I'll try to give you a bit of a flavor of both the content of the Paris Agreement, but also what could have happened and that not happened. And I'll explain in a second. So I'll give you a bit of the context, my personal context. You did say that I was in Paris. I'll explain what I was doing in Paris. Background, how did we even get to Paris, the road to Paris. But then I will take you through a hypothetical journey of what could the world be in a world without the Paris Agreement. So I'll take you to 2020 had the Paris Agreement not been adopted. And then I'll take you back to 2016 and we'll see what it means living in a post-Paris world. So how do we get to Paris? What's the context? What's the background? How do we get to the Arc de Triomphe? Well, I was there, but I was there as an observer, meaning I did not have access to the negotiations. I do not have too many juicy anecdotes and so forth. I leave that to the panel afterwards. And I have to say, this is an amazing opportunity, also for me, to listen from people who had a very active, practitioner-based role at the negotiations. Leave aside what you find in the books. This is the place to be if you want that. So I was there as an observer. I was only in the second week, from Tuesday to Saturday morning. I arrived on Tuesday afternoon at Le Bourget. It all seemed very big, very messy. I didn't really understand what was happening. I left Saturday morning before the hugs, before the "we save the world" kind of comments. And it was a great experience. I really think I got something out of it. I was so immersed in it, I don't do this very often, that while I was there, I was actually writing. And some of it is now available on the Strathclyde Centre for Environmental Law and Governance webpage, both as a policy brief and as a working paper, and I encourage you to have a look at them and share whatever comments, feedback you have. So this was literally written while I was at Le Bourget. But how do we get to Paris? How do we get from the frustration, from the tears of Copenhagen, to the cheers, the thumbs up, and the applauses of Paris? Very long story. I cannot tell you all of it. But there's one key moment that is important to highlight in this process, which is Durban in 2011. Because that sets the formal journey. In Durban, the international community decides to establish what in UNFCCC jargon is the ADP, the Ad Hoc Working Group on the Durban Platform for Enhanced Action. And what does it decide to do? It decides to launch a process, a negotiation process, to develop a protocol, another legal instrument, or an agreed outcome with legal force under the convention applicable to all parties. Most of us who are involved in climate change are happy Paris has finally arrived in order not to look at this anymore, to some extent. Because we have been discussing for ages, what does this mean? What are the options? What could happen? Finally, now we have the Paris Agreement, and we can move forward. It had to be adopted in Paris, 21st session of the COP, and for it to come into effect and implement from 2020. That is the road to Paris. That is what takes us to Paris. Last year was very intense, and it's a story of how a document shrinks. What I mean by that is that in Geneva, in 2015, you had a rather lengthy document, 50-odd pages, much less than what we had before Copenhagen, which was the starting point, if you want, of what then ended up in Paris. And throughout the year, that big book shrank, both in Bonn in June and in October, to an amazing, the first week of the LLM, we were all amazed that the document, and do correct me, ended up being 21 pages. That was unheard in international law terms. That was fantastic. It obviously then immediately went back up to 50. But the point was that even that denotated some optimism between the negotiators, that something was possible in Paris. But let me stop you there. Let me take you to a hypothetical future scenario where Laurent Fabius ends up on Saturday with this face, very frustrated, not happy, because his efforts to successfully complete the Paris conference fail miserably. Just like in Copenhagen, if not worse, colleagues go back home empty-handed, and we do not have a Paris agreement. We all talk about it. This was an option on the table. I remember talking to people in Paris involved in it, much more than myself, on Friday, and not everybody was 100% sure that this would have happened. So this hypothetical scenario was on the table. How could a 2020 world look without a Paris Agreement? Obviously, climate change in 5 years doesn't change, so the abnormal weather is normal, just like what happened in the UK in the last few months, and even in Scotland, with floods and everything, we would have even more of that in 2020. The question is whether the failure to reach the Paris Agreement makes that worse. 2020, the climate change policy has three, probably more, could have three defining features. It would be a national agenda, in some cases bilateral, but not multilateral. It would be based on deals like the one struck by the US and China earlier this year. It would be very, very national and bilateral in 2020. In 2020, funding for climate change adaptation would dwindle, if not disappear completely. Without the multilateral framework, what's the main goal? What's the main desire to fund climate change adaptation? That, in the 4 years after the failure of the Paris Agreement, is a reality. And that obviously affects some parts of the world more than others. Third characteristic of a world without the Paris Agreement: the loss and the damage caused by climate change becomes more and more a security issue. Bodies like the UN Security Council, instead of looking at climate change once every 7 years, as is the case now, actually have it on the agenda much more. And security organizations look at climate change as a very serious non-traditional threat. So this could have been the world. This could have been 2020 had the Paris Agreement not been adopted. It could have been a highly fragmented international climate change architecture led by a powerful handful of countries. The emission reductions in 2020 are nowhere near what needs to be in order to tackle climate change from a mitigation perspective. Climate finance, very limited, and security is much more linked to climate change than what it is before the Paris conference. Now, this did not happen. We did have the thumbs up. We did have the green gavel. We did have the Paris Agreement. So we are living in a post-Paris world. But what does that mean? Does it mean that the four characteristics I just mentioned will not be there in 2020? Does that mean that the Paris Agreement paves the way to more and better multilateralism? Does it mean that we will have strong mitigation? Does it mean that climate finance will be a reality even more than what it is in 2020? And does it mean that loss and damage will be effectively dealt with? So let me take you through very briefly what the Paris Agreement has said to some extent or means for mitigation, climate finance, and loss and damage. So for mitigation, this is the only slide with a lot of text. I do apologize, but now and then you have to put it in. And to some extent, it repeats what David was saying before. So there was a lot of tension on whether we should aim for 2 degrees or 1.5 or something in between. And now this is what we have in the Paris Agreement, well below 2%, and efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5. But then you yourself said in your introduction, when should this take place? What are the, obviously we're not talking about quotas anymore, targets, we have a different mindset. But yeah, the Paris Agreement talks about reaching global peaking of greenhouse gas emissions as soon as possible. I love that. I would like to see another international treaty that uses the words as soon as possible. I completely understand why they're there, and it's a good output anyway, but obviously it's not a very clear output. And also when it says in the second half of the century. Now, what you do have in terms of the actual, so if somebody asks you, what does the Paris Agreement actually ask countries to do? And I believe that Article 4.2, from a mitigation perspective, from a procedural perspective, is what you want to look at. Each party shall, and I'll get back to the shall, shoulds debates, each party shall prepare one thing, they need to prepare. 2, they need to communicate. And 3, they need to maintain successive NDCs, nationally determined contributions. So this is what, to some extent, the Paris Agreement crystallizes as the procedural obligation. The content of the Paris Agreement is much more than that, obviously, but this is one of the main ones in terms of mitigation. The question is, we could have been in a year, 2020, where the emissions would have been so high, peaking so high, that climate change was not even at sight. Does this combination of mitigation, which is obviously much more complex than those 3 articles put together, lead us in a different direction? And to be honest, the answer is it's too soon to say. We cannot really say now. But, as you already mentioned, it does set a pathway. It does set a process, which, as I was arguing this morning, commenting this morning with some colleagues, you could almost think it's never ending. We have cycles, stock take in 2018, called slightly differently. Then in 2023, there'll be an official one, and then on and on and on every 5 years. So it does create a process. That's the mitigation side. In terms of climate finance and adaptation, we have 2 ad hoc provisions, Article 7, Article 9, on adaptation and support finance. So they are present. Some people will have criticized them for the lack of a number. There's no number in the Paris Agreement. But at least, again, it sets the framework, if you want. Loss and damage I find particularly interesting. Even in the LLM, we had a lot of discussion about this. It is one of the 3 areas that, as an observer, as a commentator, I thought were particularly controversial towards the end. Some people, even in this room, were not sure that we would have an article on loss and damage. We do have it, Article 8. But we also have that language, paragraph 52 of the COP decision that accompanies the Paris Agreement, which literally says that Article 8 does not involve or provide a basis for any liability or compensation. Gets a bit technical, very legal language, but it is quite awkward to see in a treaty a statement that says whatever is in that article, it does not do that. And at the end of the last, once the Paris Agreement was already adopted, at least one country, and do correct me if I get the country wrong, I think it was Ecuador, maintained very clearly that whatever that, even with that paragraph, that does not limit options under general international law to seek liability and compensation for climate change loss and damage. So you do have it. Now, does that mean that climate change will not be a security threat? Again, it's too soon. I've been also at a side event, 2 side events at Paris where the link was clearly made. There are a lot of people working on it. Whether the Paris Agreement diffuses this tension, again, is yet to be seen. But the Paris Agreement does, again, highlight and provides place for loss and damage. Now, what I think is that what the Paris Agreement does, forget about all what I just said. The one thing that the Paris Agreement does is save may be too big of a word, but it does retain multilateralism as one of the frameworks, if not the framework, for dealing with climate change. To be honest, I'm not so sure that from a mitigation perspective, that's really the silver bullet. But what I'm really sure is that for things like climate finance and adaptation and loss and damage, without multilateralism, there is no effective loss and damage mechanism. There is no effective climate finance and adaptation. Now, it doesn't mean that because you have multilateralism, you will have effective, but I can't see it in any other way. So in that sense, I think that what we could have had in 2020, highly fragmented, just a few countries leading the whole world, that the Paris Agreement has been able to avoid. And that per se, I think, is a good thing that we have, thanks to the Paris Agreement. So let me take you to 3 general conclusions. And one is a story of how we went from tears to cheers, from smiles to thumbs up. The second one is, to some extent, when you really look at the Paris Agreement, is there anything new under the sun? And the third is a question that, interestingly, a lot of non-lawyers were asking to lawyers. And there was this frenziness about whether, even before, will it be legally binding? I always loved this idea. Even in Copenhagen, there's this fantastic picture of a guy with something written, "We will not leave until we get a legally binding fair agreement." As if putting the word law in it makes the magic happen, and we'll all go home and climate change will be solved. But still, the question is interesting, and I'll try to answer it very briefly. So we had tears in Copenhagen. We had frustration, anger, even some blood. And now we have thumbs up, cheers, everybody hugging. As I said, and this does not have to be forgotten, there still was the phantom of Copenhagen between negotiators, civil society. People were afraid. There was a lot of stakes on the French presidency, on the negotiators. People did not want to repeat Copenhagen. Climate multilateralism does provide a pathwork, but it also provides confidence. It provides some hope, which I think, and I repeat, are incredibly important for finance and adaptation and things such as loss and damage. But we also may ask ourselves, fine, okay, we still have multilateralism, but is there really nothing new under the sun? Because on the one hand, we didn't want to repeat Copenhagen, but let's be honest, a lot of what was in Copenhagen in terms of content is very much the same of what we have in the Paris Agreement. We just changed the names. So in Copenhagen, we talked about pledges, we started the bottom-up approach that you mentioned, and now we have NDCs. Okay, now we know when they will have to be submitted, we have talk staking, whatever that word is, and so forth. But is it really so new? My impression is that Copenhagen, failure as it may have been, actually started the process which has been crystallized, if you want, formalized in Paris. And I'm not saying it neither is a bad thing or a good thing. I'm just saying that as much as we didn't want to repeat Copenhagen, the outcome of Copenhagen is very much behind what we had in Paris. And finally, this question that we lawyers love. On the one hand, now we We cannot answer it anymore because it's already there, but still. And as usual, lawyers, we always answer yes, but no. So yes, it is legally binding. Once it will become, in force, a treaty, then from a formal perspective, a treaty is an international legally binding instrument. From a procedural perspective, what I said before, and I think it was Article 4.2, is legally binding. So countries will have to prepare and submit and maintain climate plans, let's call them like that, NDCs. That, to me, the way I read it, is a legally binding obligation upon states. But from a substantive perspective, if from substantive you mean, does that plan actually need to meet that specific climate target that is put in? If whatever is the content of the NDC of whatever country is not met, whether that is legally binding or not is debatable. And there were a lot of ways of making it stronger in the Paris Agreement, but that I don't think have been done. And again, there are reasons why. And it's interesting because this is exemplified by the typo that apparently happened at the end of the Paris Agreement, where a word that had to be should was written as shall, and then they decided, no, wait a second, it's actually should. Now this may, for a non-lawyer and for somebody who is new to the field, may seem a typo. There's no such thing as a typo in an international treaty like that. That is the reason why, to some extent, if we want the Paris Agreement to enter into force, and we want the US to ratify it, the US can ratify it in an easier way if what the Paris Agreement tells you to do is not legally binding. Let's put it like that. So here you have Obama practically telling to Kerry, you go to Paris, but use the word should. Don't come back to the States saying shall. If not, we have a problem. So we have that shall versus should type. But what really is interesting, I mean, obviously we all stopped in Paris, the commentators and so forth, and we wrote about it, and we read about it, and the media was frenzied about it. But to really understand Paris, you need to wait, I'll say a number, 4 or 5 years, to see how a lot of the things that were left in the Paris Agreement as, and now we'll develop the rules and the modalities, will be developed. So in particular, Article 13 and 15, which are the teeth of whatever procedural obligation or whatever obligation the Paris Agreement says, will be developed. You have some framework in the Paris Agreement, but a lot of it will have to be developed. Some based on what we already have, some in a more imaginative way, if you want. So really the question whether it will be legally binding, whatever criteria that you want, will depend very much on how, starting from Marrakesh in November this year, and for the next 4 or 5 years, these negotiations, which have not finished in Paris in one sense, will evolve. So with that, I conclude. And it's really a question which part of the picture we want to look at. Do we want to focus after Christiana Figueras, Laurence Toubiana, and Laurent Fabius cheer and applaud on the hope that multilateralism can take us to? Or should we actually still be daunted by the droughts, the desertification, and all the negative effects that climate change have? Thank you very much.